what's happening is that your animal brain feels like you're being chased by a predator, and it feels like safety comes from this Snickers bar, period. And so once we learn that, we unlearn and then learn that everything we're doing is super valid and it makes all the sense in the world. And it's actually the mind-body system working exactly as it should be. Now we can get out of the way, because every time I always say, like, as soon as you start judging yourself, you're adding another tiger into the room. Now you're running from a predator. It's just your own self, your own perception of what's happening. Because when we're in judgment and shame and blame, we are physiologically paralyzed. We can't change our behaviors. We're not drawing the awareness to it non-judgmentally, so that's what I would do, is not just draw the awareness to it, but objectively, non-judgmentally, with as much self-compassion as you can remember. You're not doing anything wrong, and this isn't your fault. And I think that's what I kind of come along and do for a lot of people, is I'm the first person that looks at someone who emotionally eats and says, you're not doing anything wrong. You're not broken.
Welcome to Alignment Adventures. This is a podcast where we explore what it means to live a fulfilling, aligning, and present life. I'm your host, Lindsay Tanner, and I am so grateful that you are here. Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Alignment Adventures. I am so grateful and so excited that you are here. And if you are here, it is not by coincidence. It is for an exact reason. And it is because you need the message in today's episode. So I had the honor of sitting down with the beautiful soul, the wise soul, gem of a human, Lisa Schlosberg. And it is such an empowering conversation around the topic of health and our relationship with food and our body image and all of that stuff. And what I love most is that, yes, we're talking about food and our relationship with food and diet culture and all of that, but it truly is a pathway to just like living a more aligning life. It is a pathway to raising your consciousness. It is a pathway to becoming more aware. So a little bit more about Lisa. So she actually has a variety of her background that she brings into her coaching. She used to be a social worker. She's a certified personal trainer, integrative nutrition, holistic health coach, yoga teacher, public speaker, and she helps emotional eaters and chronic dieters around the world achieve mind, body, soul, health, and wholeness. So you can really embody that freedom in all aspects of your life. It makes me think of a time back in Phoenix when I was at a party with a bunch of my girlfriends, probably like 10 or so women. We were just talking about our struggles with food, and we were really getting open and honest and vulnerable. And every single one of us shared how we have struggled with either our relationship with food, body image, disordered eating at some point in our life, every single one of us. And it was all over the spectrum, both ways, from undereating to overeating. And it just blew my mind. And I think it blew all of our minds that we realized every single one of us has struggled with this. Because I think a lot of times you can feel alone, you can feel a lot of shame, you can feel a lot of guilt, but you aren't alone. And what I love about Lisa's message, one of her main points, is that there's nothing wrong with you. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you in this. So the topics we cover, of course, so many different topics, but how to be the person you want to be in this world, how living in alignment isn't always a walk in the park, as we know, embodying authenticity in a society that doesn't necessarily support that. She shares her journey, which is so powerful. And I'm just very grateful for her vulnerability and honesty there. I think a lot of people are going to relate and just be blown away by her story. We talk about the mind-body connection, building awareness, and why there is nothing wrong with you. If you struggle with any of these things, it makes sense why you do the things that you do. And she really empowers you through that process. We have a huge conversation about intuitive eating, how there can be a lot of misconceptions when it comes to that phrase. That's a really, really important part of the conversation. I mean, it's all good, but definitely make sure you tune into that part, because she just shares some like mic drop moments. We talk about slowing down and realizing what our body actually needs. Sometimes we think it's food when it's really something else, like, social connection or water or other nutrients, whatever it may be, but just slowing down and tuning into your body. We talked about trapped emotions and how those affect your health. And then she also shares how trauma can affect a lot of this work and how we can, start to work through some of the traumas that we all have, because we all have either big or little traumas in our life. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into this conversation that is such an empowering and expansive conversation. And I know you guys are just going to love Lisa. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on Alignment Adventures. I am just beyond excited to dive into this topic with you, an expert. This is something that is so needed. I've talked about so many people with this issue, and just thank you for giving us your time and energy, especially in this time and space. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
Yes, me too. Okay, so we're going to start with our usual two and see where the conversation flows. But just go ahead and tell us, who is Lisa Schlosberg?
You did it.
Yes.
Wow. It's funny because like I start all my episodes too with like, tell us who you are. And people tell me all the time, it's like, that's the hardest question. And now I'm sitting in that seat and I'm like, who is Lisa Schlosberg? Wow. How do I even, I'm just a human out here doing my best too. I will tell you what I do and who I work with, even though that's just, part of who I am, obviously, but I'll start there because I think it's a good also introduction to what we're here to talk about and, navigate and explore together. So Lisa Schlosberg is the CEO of Out of the Cave, which is a health coaching business really dedicated to supporting people around disordered eating of any kind: overeating, undereating, picky eating, stress eating, emotional eating, body image issues. That's what I do and who I work with. So we can talk a little bit about, how I got here and my story and et cetera, but that is who I am and what I do. And I think what we'll get into today. I'm living in San Diego right now. I grew up in New York. I'm actually moving back to New York very soon. And I don't know, there's so many things I could tell you about myself, but I guess I'll just start there. You don't need follow-ups. I'm here for it.
No, I love that because it's so true. We are like so multifaceted. And of course, our human brains love to like categorize people and be like, oh, this and this, but we're so much more than that. So thank you for giving us just like a little taste of who Lisa is. And I'm just curious right off the bat, tell us like how you got the name Out of the Cave. Cause I'm just
great.
Curious.
Yeah, I love that. So it comes from Plato's allegory of the cave.
Oh.
So it's not very often I get to tell the story. So I can do that if you want to hear where it really comes from. So Plato, like Socrates, Plato.
Yeah, I'm familiar. It's been a while, but I'm familiar.
So it's very rare too that I connect to someone who's like, oh, Plato's allegory of the cave. Like that never happens. So Plato's allegory of the cave is really ultimately about a raise of consciousness. And what that means, I'll get to what it means for me and why it's the name of my business. But the allegory is that there are some prisoners that live in a cave. And so you kind of have to use your visual brain to kind of go there. So imagine that you are in a cave and your neck and your head are chained. So you can't move side to side and you can't see behind you. And so you're kind of staring at this wall.
Yeah.
And behind the prisoners is a fire and other people who are kind of holding up these images. So what the prisoners see in front of them, which is all they can see, are shadows on the wall. And they see these kind of movements and they see these images and they think that's the truth. Like the shadows are the thing that exists. And then one day, one of the prisoners breaks free and comes out of the cave and he sees the sun. And he's initially blinded by the sun because he's never seen real light. And so he's blinded by the sun, but then he sees his shadow behind him. And then the sun moves a little bit and his shadow moves a little bit. And he starts to figure out these were not dancing figures on the walls. These were shadows in the cave. And so he goes back into the cave and he tries to tell all of his prisoner friends that, guys, the real truth is that there's this thing and it's called the sun and it's very bright and it creates these shadows. But because the prisoners have never escaped from the cave, they think that if you leave the cave, you lose your mind. They have no concept of the sun. They can't understand what he's saying. And so he eventually leaves the cave and goes and lives a life of freedom outside of the cave. And so that's really what it's about, is about kind of seeing the truth that is, for many of us, especially when it comes to, something like diet culture, for example, we're so indoctrinated because of the way that our brain works. Our brain is trying to keep us safe. So we learn all these messages about good and bad and right and wrong. And that is what I would call the cave. We have this way of thinking, but then at a certain point, something, could be addiction, could be chronic pain, could be disordered eating, whatever it is, kind of jolts people, myself included, out of the cave to understanding there's actually so much more to it. We are a mind, body, soul being, and it's really not that simple. So that's why I remember when I first was introduced to the allegory of the cave, maybe in high school. And then I remember revisiting it for like a philosophy class in college. And it always just really stuck with me. It always resonated with me. And then, so maybe we'll get into like my story, but then when I was in college and I lost 150 pounds after an entire childhood of obesity, quote unquote, I remember thinking that when I write a book, Plato's allegory of the cave will be like the preface of the book, because I remember thinking like, no one really gets it. Like, it's not what we've been taught it was. And so it always just stuck with me. And then a few years ago, when I was building my own business, I remember for so long, I needed to like tell the lawyer what to put on the paperwork. And I was like, I don't know what to call it. I don't know what to call it. And then it was just one of those moments, like it all just dropped right in. And I was like, oh, it's called Out of the Cave. That's what it is. So that's how we got here. Thank you for asking.
I just love that this is how we started it. And I love that story, like full body chills, because, okay, how appropriate in this time to so many things, so many things. And it can really start with like maybe the way you eat or your relationship with food. And that's what I find interesting about like, our consciousness and, raising our consciousness and waking up, is that it's just like looking past the illusion and seeing the truth. That is something that is really hard. There are so many different truths out there and like trying to find the truth. So, what a beautiful story. I love that that's the name of your podcast. I love that we talked about that already.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I also feel like that's a good lead in to the next question. But that reminded me of so many things I want to ask you after this question. But what does living in alignment mean to you?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. And I think for me, living in alignment is being the person that I want to be. So very often, I think I was just teaching this the other day in my group, that in order to show up as the person you want to be, you may necessarily have to move through some withdrawal from the person that you are right now. And I think through, at least for me, it feels like as we grow and change and evolve and transform with life, we're also always grieving the loss of that which we're leaving behind. And so, like, in order for me to show up as the person that I want to be, I have to recognize that that's not the person that I am right now. And that's just like a constant process. That's the ever evolving human, conscious human, right? So for me, when I think about living in alignment, it's like connecting to the energetic blueprint of the person that I want to be, and how does she show up, and what are some of the things she would do, and then doing my best to do those things to the capacity that I have right now. And so it's not always like easy and peaceful and comfortable. I think that for me anyway, I think the myth of living in alignment is that it like comes naturally, and it not for me. I think it's quite a struggle actually. But I think that's how I would define it.
So good. And you're right. Like it just never ends. And I think that trips us up sometimes because we're always trying to like get somewhere and get there, but it's just an ever evolving, ever unfolding. And something that so needs to be talked about is like mourning your old self.
Oh, yeah.
I think that happens, or like we're not even aware that that's happening, and maybe you just like feel it, and then you realize it, and you're like, okay, it's all right to like mourn the person that I used to be. And it reminds me of an episode I did a few weeks ago. I think we're all just trying to create a better world on some level. That was like the topic, and that's exactly it. Like, who is the version of you that's going to create that world that you are dreaming of, that we're all dreaming of, and how can you show up as her or as him? Like, it's that it's simple yet hard, like you said. That's what I found as I've like recorded this podcast and dove into so many different topics. It's like it's simple, but not always easy. And
Yeah.
that's comforting to know. Like it's okay that it's not easy.
Right. And that's why I also love the out of the cave, just like allegory and metaphor, because I have to, I think, sometimes remind people that when he leaves the cave, he's initially like blinded by the sun. Like, it's not like he sees the sun. He's like, oh, amazing. Like, I am free. It's like he sees the sun and he's confused and scared and alone. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes being out of the cave is very lonely and isolating, especially, you know, with the people I work with. It's like around food and eating, and you're learning all this new mindset and just paradigm shifting. And then it feels really hard to communicate that to people, you know? So it's like, as we grow and evolve, it's not, it's not all positive and easy and great, but it's just more true. And that to
Yes.
me is like really what alignment is about, is being authentic and
Yeah.
real rather than anything else.
So good. It makes me think of like the levels of like people talk about awakening or raising your consciousness. And you're right, that is a level that can be so tough. I think that's where I am personally. It's like you realize all these things, you realize there's a different way to live, but then you're still in the society where it's a diet culture or a thing, people don't eat like the way that you're teaching people to eat, to like tune into their body. So then it's like, all these truths, but then you have to go out there and like practice it in a sea of people that don't understand.
Yeah.
So maybe this is a good time to touch on your journey, and maybe you can lead into this next question. But like, how do we do that? Like, how do we, taking what we know to be our truth, bring that into a society that doesn't necessarily support that? And you can touch on your journey too, if this feels appropriate, because I'm very curious with the things that you mentioned so far.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few kind of answers to that. How do I, and this could be around food and eating, but anything else, because I think at the root of it, what you're asking is, how do I embody authenticity, period,
Yeah.
when I live in a social context and it doesn't always feel comfortable or safe to do that?
Yes.
And so it's not so much about food. It's about, I think, one, creating safety, and two, expanding the capacity to tolerate discomfort. So the first part is creating safety. So really surrounding yourself and supporting yourself with connections with people who are also, quote unquote, out of the cave. Like, I think community is really, really, really important. And I've learned that as I've gone, because I used to be very like lone wolf. Like, I don't need anyone and I don't want anyone. And I can, I can heal all by myself. And to a degree that's true. But once I started really bringing other people into my journey and opening myself up, practicing vulnerability with other people, my healing really skyrocketed in a lot of ways. And so I think part of it is creating this safety, so that could come in a lot of forms, but part of it is having those people. Like, I think, if you're out of the cave completely alone, it doesn't feel safe to be alone. We're pack animals. So part of it is really having that connection and community, but also safety could be in the form of learning how to regulate your nervous system and make sure that you're not, uh, low key hyperventilating throughout your day. That will
Mhm.
also send messages to your brain that you're unsafe. So safety could come in a lot of different forms, but I think creating safety is part of it. And then the other part of it, because it's not all about safety. If we're always creating safety and we're in our comfort zone, then we don't really get anywhere. So the other part of it is pairing that safety with tolerating discomfort and knowing that you will embody your authenticity and tell your truth, at the dinner table or wherever else in your life.
Mm.
And it's not always going to be comfortable because and I learned this a lot around, the way that we eat and what we look like is a prime example of no matter what you do, someone's going to tell you it's wrong. So at a certain point, I kind of got to that realization where there was nothing that I could do that was going to please everyone.
Yeah.
And again, that's not really about food and eating in my body. It's about like much deeper seated things of my safety lies in the hands of other people thinking that I'm good enough or whatever. And so I think knowing that it's going to be uncomfortable, because if you eat this way, someone's going to tell you it's wrong. And if you eat that way, someone else is going to tell you it's wrong. And if you look this way in some culture, you're going to be the beauty ideal. And in another culture, you're not. And so there is no like quote unquote absolute truth around good and bad and right and wrong when the judge is outside of you or the power is given to someone else. And so I think around, again, just embodying what is true for you in your life, it has to have both of those parts. We have to create the safety and we also have to tolerate the discomfort. And I think it's kind of a dance of navigating all of that.
Why is it always the dinner table that like I feel like is that's what I imagine too. I'm like, this is going to come up at the dinner table, and like, how am I going to respond? What am I going to say if someone asks me about this or that? Like, that's the situation I always play out, which is interesting because we're also eating.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
You are not alone there.
Like the connections there,
Yeah.
And I've been noticing recently, I think that's such a powerful thing to be aware of is like, okay, like I'm feeling uncomfortable. Like this is uncomfortable for me right now. Can I just observe myself through this uncomfortability? Because I feel like a lot of people can relate with that. People pleasing tendency, still something I'm working through. It's just like observing it and being like, okay, I'm not going to conform just to please these people. Like you said, living in alignment is living your truth, being authentic. So such good reminders. Now, here's why I feel like we can connect it to your story. How do we find our truth? And like, what was that journey like for you in finding your own truth?
Well, it is, like we said, an ongoing journey. It is always evolving. Let's see. I don't know how far back to go, but I guess
Whatever
I'll
feels
just,
right.
yeah, I'm like, I'll just go with the version of my story that feels like being told today. So when I was 5 years old, up until that point, I thought, or as a kid in general, I thought like I was great. I was fine. I didn't need help from anyone or anything. Everything was great. But when I was 5 years old, the only thing that I really wanted in my life was not just a cat. I wanted a cat, but I also really wanted a little sister. I had an older sister, and all I wanted was a little sister. I wanted to be the older one. And when I found out that I was going to have a younger sister, everything opened up. It was like this, it was the best day of my life. And then my younger sister was born 3 months early, and she was alive for 5 months. And at that time, I had no idea how to cope with that. There wasn't really a lot of space for me. A lot of people thought I was 5 years old. I probably didn't even really understand what was going on. But my world collapsed when that happened. And so I start there because around that time, and now I understand in hindsight with the clinical brain that I have, I didn't have access to drugs or alcohol or cigarettes or gambling. I didn't have access to things that were going to help me cope. And I used food. And food was like a drug for me when I was lonely and sad and scared, which I was. And I felt really alone in that experience, which I was, to no one's fault. Food was there for me the way it is for a lot of people. So that was the beginning of not telling the truth. When someone said, "How are you?" I said, "Fine." When someone said, "Do you have feelings?" I said, "No." And I thought feelings were stupid. And I thought therapy was stupid. And I just completely, I was a conglomerate of defense mechanisms for the first 20 years of my life. And, we all are to some degree, but it started very early on that I would notice a thought and I would reject it and say, "I'm not thinking about that." And I would have feelings and I would say, "Absolutely not." And I just started very early on using food as the mechanism that allowed me to repress, suppress, deny, reject, avoid, dissociate. And it was very helpful. It did its job. beautifully. And so that's how then I was over 300 pounds when I was 17 years old, because that was my childhood, was just pretending to be fine. And that's how I could do it. So then when I was in college, I decided, I mean, throughout my childhood, my parents tried many, many times to put me on a diet. My pediatrician wrote me a note to go to Weight Watchers when I was 9 years old. And I had many, nutritionists and dietitians and doctors and experts. But I always interacted with them the same way, which was I would tolerate it for like 1 or 2 or 3 meetings or whatever it was. And then I would get to a point where I decided it just wasn't worth it. Paying attention. And again, I understand it now, but that was my source of safety, period. And what people were trying to do was take it away from me. And I think that's the really tragic thing about overweight children is no one's asking what happened. It's not about what happened to you. Are you okay? It immediately becomes like you're the problem and you're doing something wrong. So that was my story for a long time, but I wasn't having it. I didn't want anything to do with it. And I just lived in complete denial about that and everything else. So then I went to college, and I don't think it's random at all that I was outside my home. I left my family and I was in a brand new environment where I really found a lot of safety and connection. And so my sophomore year of college, I basically took myself on a diet. This is the very brief version of the story. And I really swung the pendulum from the disorder of overeating to the disorder of undereating. And then I lost a lot of weight really quickly, but it was through like really restrictive, really extreme dieting and exercising. And at the end of that, I had lost probably like 130 or 40 pounds or something. And I called a nutritionist who is a friend of my mom's, and I was very confused about why I couldn't lose the last 10 pounds. And she was the one that said, "Are you still getting your period?" And I was like, that is so crazy that you asked me that. How did you know that I just get my period for the first time in my life? How did you know that? And she explained to me that I had to stop for now, that my body was in starvation mode and it was fighting me to keep weight on. And I was underfed and malnourished. And that's why my hair was falling out and I couldn't sleep or poop. And I was fatigued all the time. And I couldn't memorize anything when I tried to study for my exams. I had no idea what was going on with me. I just remember thinking I did what everyone my whole life told me to do. Every doctor told me to eat less and exercise more. And I did. I just didn't ever know. No one tells you, or no one told me as an overweight kid and teenager, that there even is such a thing as eating too little and exercising too much. So I was mind blown. And on top of that, I had actually gone to my pediatrician, my parents' doctor, an OBGYN, and an endocrinologist over the previous like 6 months, because I felt sick and I didn't know what was going on. And it took a nutritionist to finally say, all my doctors said, congratulations, you lost all this weight and you are the healthiest you've ever been. Just maintain it for a while and your body will function again. And it was a nutritionist who actually taught me about needing to exercise a little bit less and eat a little bit more and really restore my body. But I'm saying all of that because that was the moment, or I would say that was the beginning of actually needing to tell the truth, because that was the beginning of really coming back inside my body and now focusing on really holistic health and restoring myself, because I realized that at a certain point, with the help of my therapist at the time, realizing that what I did was sacrifice my health for my weight. And I was so conditioned to believe that they were one and the same thing. But at the end of my weight loss, I remember saying, this is the least happy and the least healthy I have ever been. And now I need to really figure it out. How am I supposed to live in this body while also maintaining my mental health and emotional health and just general well-being, because that was never taught to me. So that was the beginning of coming back inside. And I think in a lot of ways, my weight loss journey was the beginning of needing to come back inside, because, and I think that's why, for a lot of people, it can be just like it was for me, very quote unquote disordered. I always put quotes around that word because I don't like it and it doesn't resonate. Nothing that we're doing is disordered. It's just the mind body system doing what it does. But
Yeah.
it can be that way. But for me, needing to prioritize what I ate and how much I ate was the first time my mind and my body had to be connected. And in a lot of ways, taking responsibility for my weight was the first thing that brought me back inside a very traumatized, very disorganized, very disconnected mind body system. So for me, that's why I always say, like, in the work that I do with people, we're really using your relationship with food as the mechanism through which you learn how to reparent yourself. Because it's not about the food. It's about the fact that, if you feel like you can't listen to or don't have access to hungry and full, my first question is, where did you get disconnected? Like, why aren't we listening to our bodies? Because those are our factory settings. We're designed to do that. So anyway, does that answer your question?
Yes. And just thank you for sharing that and being so vulnerable and honest. I know that's probably never easy to reshare all of that. And I just appreciate it so much. And I'm sure so many people resonate with the fact that, it is interesting. Like, as we're children, you're right, you don't have access to a lot of other ways to cope. And I hope it's changing, but unfortunately, a lot of us aren't taught how to cope. And this thing that we need to survive, that, is one of the best parts of being human, food is delicious, is so often we just have this very unhealthy relationship due to something else that happened. So it just thank you for sharing that. And I also find it mind blowing that the people that we should trust, and no fault to them, it's just a part of the system that we go to for answers, lead us down wrong path after wrong path after wrong path. And I love that, like, what you're doing is helping people like heal their relationship with food. But along with that, you're, like you said, you're just helping them come back into their body. I feel like so many of us, me included, like, I'm still learning as well, have just like escaped our body over time. And it's just like being in it and paying attention. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Like, what can people do if they're listening and they're resonating and they're like, yes, I know I probably have like unresolved traumas from childhood, or I just know I have a really unhealthy relationship with food. Like, where do we start?
Yeah, good question. So I always say we can't do anything about something we're not aware of. So I think a lot of people kind of hear this or resonate with this. And, at least for me, like, my personality pattern is so like, dive right in, tell me what to do and I'll do it. And it's like, it can be kind of underwhelming or disappointing to hear that. For me, the first step is draw the awareness to because again, it's like, we want to listen to our body. We want to feel safe, to honor intuitive eating, eat when we're hungry, stop when we're full. But then if I suggest something like mindful eating, which is really just to say, like, can you connect your mind to your body? Your body is the one that's eating. Can you connect your mind to that activity? So can we like put the phone down? Can we turn the TV off? Can we just take like a breath before we start feeding ourselves? And there's usually a lot of resistance to doing that, right? It's like, no, but I want you to tell me what to do. It's like, that's really valid and very fair. And also, that's where I would begin, is just start looking at your eating habits, whatever they are. Because a lot of people, again, like, even if you didn't have like a big T childhood trauma and food was your coping mechanism, along the way, your brain learns that if you're really stressed out, you can use food to bring your stress down. And if you're in a bad mood, you can also use food to bring your mood up. Like, that's the brain chemistry of eating food. Dopamine and serotonin are two of the four quote unquote happy chemicals, the other two being oxytocin and endorphins. But every single time we eat anything, the brain releases happy chemicals. Like that's the way it works because it wants us to survive. Our brain is what we are wired as human beings to be emotional eaters. So if you're eating when you're emotional, you're eating when you're stressed, or you're just noticing that your eating habits are like kind of erratic, just start paying attention. Just start asking questions. Why am I eating? Am I hungry right now? What am I responding to? And you might notice that some of it is you're feeling bored. Boredom is a valid emotion, by the way. A lot of people are like, I don't know, it's just boredom. It's not emotional. Boredom is an emotion. It's actually what some people would consider the least tolerable emotion. And so we live now, we have this animal brain that thinks we need food just to survive, and that, there's scarcity around it. But the truth is, for many of us, we have access to food. That's not the issue. But we live in such a kind of like go, 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 go state. I think many of us are stuck in hyper arousal of that kind of fight or flight energy, or hypo arousal, which is that freeze response. And so food is a way of coping and managing. So the first thing to do is just start paying attention. When are you eating? What are you eating? What are the thoughts going on around food? What are you feeling before, during, and after your experience of eating? And just like, again, become mindful, not just of, every single bite that you take. I understand that that's not always realistic, but what is your relationship with food like? And just start there and get curious. But I think the other thing to do is we have so much unlearning to do around food. Like, I think a lot of us use food because we're emotional or stressed out, which is the most normal human valid thing ever. It's literally a brain chemistry reaction. And like, but we have all this messaging that we're doing something wrong. We should be ashamed. We have no willpower. It's a matter of discipline. Like, that's all what I would call in the cave. Like, those are dancing shadows on the wall. That's not it. That's actually not at all what's happening. What's happening is that your animal brain feels like you're being chased by a predator, and it feels like safety comes from this Snickers bar, period. And so once we learn that, we unlearn and then learn that everything we're doing is super valid, and it makes all the sense in the world. And it's actually the mind-body system working exactly as it should be. Now we can get out of the way, because every time I always say, like, as soon as you start judging yourself, you're adding another tiger into the room. Now you're running from a predator. It's just your own self, your own perception of what's happening. Because when we're in judgment and shame and blame, we are physiologically paralyzed. We can't change our behaviors. We're not drawing the awareness to it non-judgmentally, so that's what I would do, is not just draw the awareness to it, but objectively, non-judgmentally, with as much self-compassion as you can remember. You're not doing anything wrong, and this isn't your fault. And I think that's what I kind of come along and do for a lot of people. Is I'm the first person that looks at someone who emotionally eats and says, you're not doing anything wrong. You're not broken. And I think a lot about going back to what is it to be in alignment. I just think about, how do I show up as the person that I needed? And I think that's what I'm doing, at least with the, the clientele that I have. We've just taken in so much shame that we can't get anywhere. Shame is paralyzing, period. So if you want to change your behaviors, it's not just being aware of them, but it's also understanding, accepting, forgiving, and being on your own team. It's all really a journey, again, back to yourself with love, right? It's not the journey back to self with fear and shame. You can only really come back to yourself when you're doing it with curiosity and compassion. So that's what I would do.
So good. So good. So many things. I'm like, yes. I want to write it all down and ask her about this, and this. But what sticks out to me the most, and I was just listening to your speech on YouTube, which I'm going to link because everyone should go listen to it. It's the fact that, like, there's nothing wrong with you. And unfortunately, I hate to like go down rabbit holes and like focus too much on like the negative. But unfortunately, these companies capitalize on the fact that there's something wrong. Like, they make you think that there's something wrong with you, and that you need this pill or this diet or whatever to fix that, when that couldn't be farther from the truth. Like, you're doing exactly what you needed to do to survive. And like you said, it's just bringing awareness. I always say that too, like low key, not so much low key. The most important thing is awareness and like moving from there. So good. Just I've even been feeling that nudge too lately. Like it's so habitual for me, even when I'm having a snack, to like put on a YouTube video or like watch something. I'm like, no, just like enjoy how good it tastes, because it tastes freaking amazing. Like just make it a whole experience, you know? Um, I would love to hear your thoughts. You mentioned it too, and this is something I've talked about in here, but I think people struggle with it, is intuitive eating. And it connects to a big part of my message, is just connecting to your intuition. So what are your thoughts on intuitive eating? Maybe like misconceptions, like where do people go wrong? How can people like step into that more?
Yeah, great question. So I will say that if anyone who's listening to this wants the very long answer to this, I have 2 podcast episodes about intuitive eating.
We will link them.
One is a solo episode of just myself talking about intuitive eating, and I put it in quotes in the title for a reason. And then I have another one that is a really, really solid conversation with someone who is an intuitive eating counselor, where we talk about kind of how we see eye to eye, and also in some ways that we don't necessarily. We have different clientele. But part of the reason I love that episode with Laura Days is because we're coming from 2 different places and we treat people differently, but we both have the consciousness of saying there's space for both of us. Like we're not debating, we just do it differently. And we work with people who need different things. So anyway, if you want to hear all of that, there are 2 episodes that will speak to that. But I start there too, because I think it's important to clarify, when I'm asked about intuitive eating, I always like to say that there's intuitive eating, which is, there's a book called Intuitive Eating, and there are 10 principles of quote unquote how to do it. And it's written by these 2 women. And there is a big kind of movement around it, so that people sometimes, if you're, especially in my kind of corner of the internet, if you're saying intuitive eating, sometimes it's assumed that you're talking about these 10 principles and these 2 women and the programs they've created and the counselors that they're training. And it's very, there's kind of like a formula to it. And it can be, how do I want to say this? Dogmatic in my experience. Okay. So there's like that cultural movement that is called intuitive eating. And then there's intuitive eating, just like the way that you're talking about it. It's just like just listening to your body. But since in my experience, they've kind of like coined the term, sometimes it can get mixed up. Like, what intuitive eating am I actually talking about? Am I talking about Evelyn Tribole and her book? Or am I talking about like just a general practice of listening to your body? Or both, right? Because obviously there's overlap. But I also say that because I don't necessarily align with some of how the more kind of formulaic book approach of intuitive eating is shared. And I'll, again, let people go listen to my podcast if they want to hear what I do and don't agree with there. But in terms of like listening to the body in a general sense, I think something that comes up for me around this a lot is like the way that I phrase it when I'm teaching it in my group is, we can't be intuitive around hungry and full until we're coping with our emotions in a way that is not eating or dieting. So I'll go back to something Brene Brown sometimes says about how you can't selectively numb. And the reason she's saying that is because if you're trying to numb out or avoid all of the quote unquote negative emotions, so if you're trying to numb your grief and your pain and your discomfort, well, you can't selectively numb. You can't just numb the bad stuff. You're also numbing, gratitude and love and connection and joy. You can't selectively numb. If you're numbing your experience, you're numbing your experience. And that's why also, you've probably experienced this as well, the more you go to those deep, dark places, you're also expanding your capacity for the really bright places.
Yes.
And that's just the way of the human experience. So I say that because I use that kind of concept, but a little bit differently. That is, you can't selectively numb, meaning if you have anxiety that lives in your gut and you do everything you can to not feel that, how then do you expect to feel hunger? That's another sensation that lives in your gut. That's a sensation that you feel when you're in your body. Okay, so the same is true where if we feel grief or sadness, right? Emotion is energy in motion, literally. Emotion is energy in the body, whether we know it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not. I think as time goes on, right, somatics and somatic healing, somatic experiencing is getting more and more known. And what that means is that it's drawing the awareness to our bodies. Where am I feeling anger? Where am I feeling anxiety? What does sadness feel like in my body? And when you are allowing yourself, or even just practicing that it is safe to be in your body for your feelings, now to me, that unlocks access to, do I need food? Do I need water? Am I tired? Am I lonely? Like what is the need that I need to meet? But that's why for so many of us, I think, if we're coming from, again, a lifestyle of just go, 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 you may not think of yourself as dissociated and disconnected, right? But if you take a breath to like slow down, right, what you're doing is moving out of your sympathetic fight or flight nervous system and into your parasympathetic nervous system, which is also known as rest and digest. Like what you're doing is preparing your body to eat food, because you can't be. The other thing I like to just, educate people about is you can only be in the stress or the stress relief response at any given point. And so the rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system is, it's like you can't properly eat and digest food if you're running from a tiger. And for many of us, we're running from a tiger all day long, whether we think about it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not. But that's what's happening in the system. So in a general sense, I think in order for us to listen to our bodies and practice intuitive eating, it really begins not with hunger and full, but somatic awareness in a general sense, so that you have an idea of, what do you need? Because sometimes you just like, I use this example sometimes where I'm like, I'll slow down, which by the way is not easy. Like I'm saying, I'm like, just take a breath. Like it can feel so unfamiliar, uncomfortable, unsafe, threatening to even do that. Because again, if you're like me, your brain has associated go, 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 go with survival. So if you try to slow down, it can feel really unsafe and very uncomfortable. And that's really valid. It's just a practice. But I think sometimes it's very telling to me that I will get myself to slow down. And after, 3 minutes of like deep breathing with my eyes closed, all of a sudden I'm like, I wonder how long I've had to pee for. Like, I didn't even know that I needed to do that until I consciously slowed down enough that my body could communicate to me. And now I can receive that message and go do something about it. But I think we have this illusion of intuitive eating that it's going to just happen. And I don't think we can really access, right? It's intuitive eating. It's our intuition.
Yeah.
We need to actually create space and safety for that intuition to communicate to us. And when we are, scrolling every free second of the day, and again, like guilty, but when we're always in that like overconsumption, over-consuming place, of course we're not feeling connected to our bodies. And then we quote unquote have issues around food. We don't have issues with food. We just aren't present in our human experience, which for me is why it's like, it's not about food. It's about using your relationship with food as the mechanism through which you learn how to reparent yourself. And what that means is, what are the problems here? What isn't getting met? What do I really need? And that's what I will say about intuitive eating for now.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if you could tell I was taking notes because I was like, gotta hit on this, this, and this. So good. Like what you've said, so true. Like this is a doorway to so many deeper things on like how to be a happy, fulfilled, thriving human. Like, yes, we're talking about food, but this expands so much farther than that. And that's what I love about this work, because everyone can relate to this. We all have to eat. And you know, what's interesting, you were talking about being in rest and digest. Like, how many people, I've been saying this for the past few years, have digestive issues? Talk to anyone and they have some kind of digestive issue. No wonder why. I mean, my theory is, one, maybe it's because, yeah, they're always on the go and they can't digest, or they have all those trapped emotions, like you said, that prevent their body from doing what it needs to do. And I find that just so interesting. You know, maybe you don't feel like you struggle with the eating stuff, but maybe you just have digestion issues. Like, this helps that as well.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Well, it's funny you say that too, because after I lost all my weight, I struggled with IBS and I had a lot of digestive issues. And again, if this is stuff that resonates with people, Nicole Sachs is someone that I work with. She's really carrying the message of Dr. John Sarno, who is I would consider one of the fathers of like mind body medicine. But that's what all her and their work boils down to, is that when we have a reservoir of repressed emotion, it really can show up as chronic pain symptoms, because again, like the brain is wired to protect you, and your body, in the right environment, every organ of the human body heals itself. So if those things, like if we have, I mean, acute pain is one thing, because, you know, you might break a limb or tear a ligament or whatever, like those things happen, but it's when things become chronic that then we can start to look at like, what are the imbalances? What are the needs that aren't being met? And a lot of it, like Dr. Gabor Mate also has a book about when the body says no, and how, so again, I'm just saying that for anyone who's listening to this, where if you're struggling with chronic pain, and that could be anything from like migraines to digestive issues to acne, fibromyalgia, arthritis, it could be so many different things that show up. To also look into John Sarno, Nicole Sachs. I know Alan Gordon is another one, but there's this entire field now that is working with chronic pain from this mind-body, trauma-informed brain science approach, because it's literally exactly what you just said. It's like we repress so much that it's like, I mean, when I teach it, it's like we're a closed system of energy, right? Energy cannot be created or destroyed. So if we have energy that is emotion that isn't being released, where's it going to go?
Yeah.
You know, and anyway, so that's like a whole rabbit hole, but I want to offer that if that's true for anyone that's listening.
Well, I'm going to look those people up because it just makes sense to me. It makes sense. Like, we can't isolate these things. That's another question I had for you, like mind, body, soul. We always tend to like ignore one or two of them. And that's what makes us up as humans. So like, it just blows my mind. And again, I don't want to get stuck on like the negative, but that you go to the doctor and they don't like tend to all parts of you. So of course we need doctors that are like mind body doctors. I love that. Now, another thing I wanted to mention about intuitive eating, and this is a big thing I, talk about and teach on here, is like connecting with your intuition. I just love how you describe that. It takes time, and how you connect with your intuition from my point of view is being in your body and being present. So it's like always goes back to those things of like just being present. And I always say it's like a muscle. So I'm sure you do maybe encounter people with your work, and like maybe that's where people have struggled with intuitive eating. It's like, okay, you got to like build your muscle to your intuition first. And like you said, be aware first and go from there. So thank you for sharing all that. Now, one more thing I do want to touch on, because I know you are a trauma-informed coach, and I just think this is useful and pertains to a lot of people right now. Like, first of all, I'm just curious, what does that mean? And two, like when it comes to trauma, I guess, where can people start? Like, what do you do with that's a big question, right? But like, what is your experience? And we kind of already touched it in terms of eating, like how can show up with like unhealthy eating patterns. But yeah, what do we do with our trauma? Big question.
How long we got?
I know.
No, I think it is a big question. And I first will say, with any trauma, like I think it's important to just call out like therapy and like really working with someone who is qualified to sit with you in that is really important, because I think, there's a lot of truth to being able to help and heal yourself. And my God, you can do a lot, But when it comes especially to like the big T traumas, or things that you just kind of keep getting like really, really triggered by or anything, outside professional help and support is really important. And like the first thing that I will say.
1000%.
Having said that, I'm going to go back to your question now of what does it even mean? What does trauma informed mean? Well, I appreciate you asking because so I think that's been what I've called myself, at least for what are we in 2023? Probably the last 4 or 5 years or so. And for me, I'll tell you what it means for me, because I can't speak for everyone who calls themselves a trauma informed something or other. I think especially in the world of coaching, which by the way is completely unregulated. You know,
Sure.
I have issues with this just because like Joe Schmo off the street can put that he's a coach in his Instagram bio the same way that like someone who like myself has certifications and gone through programs for has actually worked for that. So anyway, that speaks to an entire other conversation. So I'm saying that because it's like, I know what trauma informed means to me, but I think that there are probably other people who are like, I've read a book about trauma. I'm informed, you know, I could just say that. That is when I first started working with people, I was a personal trainer. So I called myself a personal trainer. Then I became a integrative nutrition holistic health coach. Then I started calling myself a health coach. Then I started calling myself a holistic personal trainer because I was working with people, but I was also really offering something more holistic than just training. Yeah. Then I got my master's in social work. So for 2 years, I was in a graduate program at NYU and I was being trained as a therapist. And so that's where trauma informed for me came from, was a 2-year higher education degree in social work where I was learning how to work as a therapist. That's where it comes from for me. That is, I'm not calling myself a therapist. The work that I do is not psychotherapy, but I graduated with a master's in social work and I integrated that into my coaching practice. So it's more than holistic health coaching. Yeah. But it's not therapy. Yeah. So for me, it's trauma-informed health coaching. And that's for me where it comes from. That is, and especially after working, for example, like with Nicole Sachs in the chronic pain community for years at this point, I'm very educated about these things. I would by no means call myself an expert, but I understand a trauma-informed approach to working with our relationship with food. Yeah. And so in a lot of ways, like there are some kind of principles of, again, what does it mean to work with people in a trauma-informed way? And that can mean compassion, not judgment. It's never about telling people what to do. When we're healing around trauma, we have to know that we are safe, we are in charge, we are empowered, we get to make the decisions. And that's why it's so important. And I think in some ways, novel, if people are struggling with their relationship with food, I'm never going to tell someone what to do or how to do it. All I really do, and the reason it's a trauma-informed approach, is I'm actually decidedly not telling you what to do. Yes. I'm here to ask you questions that will support you in reconnecting with yourself so that you can take a step in whatever direction feels most resonant and aligned for you and your well-being. But to me, that's what trauma-informed means. It's not someone coming in and giving you directions or demands, which again is diet culture, or anti-diet culture for that matter. But I'm just here to really help people reconnect with themselves. And to me, that's what trauma-informed is about, is creating a safe space where people can embody authenticity and tell the truth. And I think that's, again, back to your question, what do we do with trauma? By the way, I mean, my belief is we all have trauma, big T's, little T's, could be, death by 1,000 cuts. It might not be that one big thing, but trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happens inside of you. That's a Gabor Mate quote, because what he's saying is trauma, like for me, the way I paraphrase that is trauma is not a matter of your opinion. Trauma is a matter of brain science. So if you were ever in a position where you felt scared, helpless, powerless, emotional, right? we all have those, whether they're big or small. So we all have trauma. So I think the thing to do is not be afraid of it, not have to run away from it, and slowly, gently, potentially with the help of a professional, we start to look at it and tell the truth about it. And that could be through a journal practice. That's a lot of Nicole Sax's work, is she calls it journal speak, learning how to give it a voice, see it, hear it, honor it, be present with it. Because I think that's the other kind of misconception is a lot of us are asking the question, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And what we really need is to be seen and heard and validated and accepted for our thoughts and our feelings and our experience exactly as it is, exactly as we are. And part of that you can do alone in something like a journal practice or movement. And part of it is also being seen and heard and validated by other human beings because we live in a social context. So that's a lot, but that's what I would do, or that's how I understand it.
Such a good way to wrap that up. You are so wise. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. And I love what you said about coaching because you're right. It's an unregulated field. But the best coaches, in my opinion, yeah, just empower you to find the answers within yourself or empower you to, find your truth. That's what it comes back to. That's where we started. It's where we end up. It comes back to finding your own truth. So I have a few more questions for you as we wrap this up, but thank you so much for sharing that. Now, I think this is a good lead into how you can help people, but how, someone listening is like, yes, I need someone to like hold my hand through this. I need someone to ask me those questions. How can they connect with you and work with you on all these different things?
Thank you for asking. So the first thing, as always, is like I mentioned, I also have a podcast. So if you want to listen to that, get more familiar with me and my approach, I would send you there, the Out of the Cave podcast with Lisa Schlosberg. But if you are looking to work with me directly, I have a 14-week coaching program. And this coaching program is my everything. It is my baby child, and it is everything that I think anyone needs to know. So I've been doing this for, it's just going on. Next year will be 4 years of this curriculum. So it's very in-depth, comprehensive, holistic, and will basically walk you through how you got here, how to get out, and how to maintain it, really. So that's the best way. And really right now, the only way to work with me directly is that group coaching program. The next round of that group will start in January 2024. So as you're listening to this, it is open enrollment, and you can either go to the website. I'll share the links with you. Website, my email is lisaschlosberg@gmail.com. You're welcome to email me, and you can also DM me on Instagram, lisa.schlossberg. So any way that you want to get in touch with me and, just reach out, let me know you're interested. Happy to take it from there.
What a beautiful time to start things too. I know people can kind of go crazy with their New Year's resolutions, but I think everyone needs a reset that time of year. So that's perfect. Yeah. And I love what you said about, being a trauma-informed health coach. First of all, I think you should trademark that. And that solves a lot of the problems we were talking about earlier. Like, doctors just look at it from a medicine point of view and, you're looking at it from a holistic point of view because we're a holistic being. So I just love that so much. Now, my last two questions are just kind of fun questions. What's your favorite alignment activity right now? So an alignment activity for me is like something you just love doing because it brings you so much joy and presence and you like forget time and space are passing. I just find it interesting to hear what people are doing.
I love that. And I think for me, it really, not always, but a lot of the time comes back to movement for me. And I think that my relationship with exercise, I mean, that's a whole other podcast, but
yes,
I think, it really was one of those things that it was one of the first things that connected me to my body. And I can admit and totally acknowledge that it was coming from a place of I wanted to lose weight. Sure. But I had no idea how deeply healing it would actually become, because it meant that I was coming back inside my body and becoming really aware of my body, and in many, many ways, moving myself out of that freeze stress trauma response into movement. So movement to me always carries a lot of meaning and has been very healing. And that is something that, whether it's yoga or running or lifting, that's the thing that I will be happy to just put my phone across the room, put my headphones on, and be with myself in my body. And that is very healing to me.
Couldn't agree more. And I hope you don't mind me sharing, but I saw something on your Instagram the other day. Like, that's where a lot of your processing happens.
Yeah.
And like with everything going on right now, we won't get into that, but that's where like you were able to process a lot of things. And a lot of times when we move, like emotions can come out and things can come out. And I agree. My mindset around movement has changed so much from like, oh, it's a punishment to it's truly a gift to myself, mind, body, and soul. So such a good reminder of that. Now, my last question just kind of wraps it all up, and this can be a tough one sometimes, but if you just had one piece of advice for anyone listening on this path, struggling with any of the multitude of things that we talked about, what would that one piece of advice be?
It's actually very easy, because it always to me comes back to, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not broken. It's okay. It's okay. And whatever the behavior is, whatever the habit is that you're struggling with or judging or wrestling with or trying to release or whatever it is, I think it's really, really important that we always come back to what is just fundamentally neurobiologically factual. That is, it's not your fault and you're not doing anything wrong. So you don't need the judgment and the shame. You can release all of that and really meet yourself with acceptance and love and compassion. You, despite whatever you have been taught or told, are worthy of that, period.
Just soaking that in, that hit on my emotions. That was good. That was deep. Lisa, you were such a gem of a human. I just appreciate you so much. I'm so grateful that we got connected through Natalie, by the way, which people know who Natalie is. And I'm just so appreciative to have you on here, sharing your wisdom and your soul with everyone. So thank you for your work and what you're doing to make this world a better place. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. Such a pleasure being here. And I feel like we could talk for a million years. There's so much. So thank you for having me. Seriously, such a pleasure. And in my time zone right now, it's 11:11. So
I love it.
Look at that.
Oh my gosh, it's 1:11 here.
Wow.
That's crazy. Yeah. I was like, oh, I wonder what it is here for 2 hours later.
Talk about alignment.
I love it. Thank you, universe. Thank you, universe. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And yeah, I'd love to have you back on someday. Maybe we can talk about many of the different things we could have done a whole episode on.
Awesome. Thank you.
Lisa, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. That was one of my favorite conversations and so important. And I know so many people need to hear that message. So if you want to connect with Lisa and work with her, she has her group coaching program coming up in January. You can connect with her on Instagram at Lisa Schlosberg. That's LISA.SCHLOSBERG. And I will link all that in the show notes. You can also go to her website, outofthecave.health, or check out her podcast, Out of the Cave. I will link those 2 episodes that we talked about connected to intuitive eating, and also her speech on YouTube that I found really insightful, which she has quite a few speeches on there. It's so cool, all the public speaking that she does. But make sure you go and connect with Lisa. Send her a message if you want to work with her. This work is so, so powerful. And I know a lot of people could really benefit from just the work that she puts out there. So be sure to share any takeaways you have with either of us on Instagram. You can tag Lisa. You can tag myself at Lindsay with an A, M as in Michelle Tanner. Share this episode with anyone that needs to hear this message, anyone that you think could benefit from this conversation around our relationship with food and the relationship with ourselves, and really getting that empowerment back when it comes to food. And if you are new here, please subscribe. We have new episodes every single Monday. I have a lot of interviews lined up for this month. Sometimes they're solo episodes. It really kind of varies, but I do have a lot of expansive and incredible interviews for the month of November. And I'm just sending you all so much love, all the highest vibes. And of course, I will see you in next week's episode of Alignment Adventures.